All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Today is the biology of behavior. We talked a little bit about this last week, but biology is somewhat important to psychology. I just wanted to just outline a little bit of why biology is important. So, kind of going along with the biological perspective from last week, or also known as the neuroscience perspective from last week, this idea of biology being tied into brain function and how we think, kind of like the cognition of human beings, and also how we behave and how we feel is something relatively modern. But since it is so modern, it's something that as we continue to learn and develop psychology, it's something that's continuing to be important and more ever increasingly so. It's important to sort of understand what is almost the basis of our behaviors and how we're feeling and how we're thinking. So that's why it's important to look at the biology, especially the nervous system is what we're going to be focusing on today. And it's especially important because it can inform a better understanding of psychological disorders and especially their treatments. As you see, I included a picture of what might be a treatment for depression or anxiety. There's a lot of clinical or prescribed medicines and drugs that are prescribed to alleviate symptoms of these disorders. And these drugs are new understanding that our biology is tied into our psychology as well. So kind of getting started, the neurons are a type of cell, and they're going to be the building block of the nervous system. So by building block, just think about it as like a Lego, literally like a Lego. The neuron right here is going to be the unit, the basic unit of the nervous system. And like you have different blocks in Legos, you can mix and match these different neurons to create very complex systems, such as your nervous system, your brain, the spinal cord, and whatnot. But this, on the most basic level, this is what comprises the nervous system. What is the nervous system? It's the center of cognition and thought. It includes your brain, spinal cord, which is basically a very thick bundle of a bunch of these neurons, and then nerves going from out of the spinal cord. So I see we have a question here saying that, does the nervous system have anything to do with feeling nervous, or is that different stuff? So yeah, the nervous system, it's basically important for your movements, your actions, pretty much anything dealing with sensation, perception, feeling. So yeah, definitely. If you feel nervous, that's probably something that you're experiencing through, not just in your brain with these electrical chemical signals, but through the rest of your body. You know how a lot of people, when they say they're feeling nervous, they get like butterflies in their stomach. If you think about a hunter 100,000 years ago, it would be a reaction when they saw a tiger, primitive reaction of like fear and anticipation. So that's what feeling nervous is. So that's why your body sort of prepares you for that, even though most of the time we're feeling nervous, not about very physical things, but more abstract things like maybe a test or a performance or something like that. So good question. Okay, so these neurons are the basic cells that comprise the nervous system. And even within these neurons, you have their different parts. So looking at this diagram here, you can see some parts labeled. So a common analogy or metaphor that a lot of people use to describe what these look like are almost like tree roots or tree branches. These structures, the dendrites, they do look like tree roots, and they're kind of like what you might call the receiving end of the neuron. Then you have this big section here, and that's called the soma, or the cell body. So this is where everything the cell needs to survive. So its important structures, everything it needs to maintain itself, is going to be centered here. And then you see this long, skinny, almost like a telephone pole or an electrical wire, and that's called the axon. And that's used to sort of transmit these signals of the nervous system down this axon, down this long cable. This axon, it branches off into these various, almost like different branches of a tree. And these are called axon terminals. Terminal meaning coming to an end. These are where the axon ends, and as we'll see, that's kind of where the transmission to the next neuron will happen when these neurons are in a system. So just to quickly recap, this is the neuron. The dendrites, they're on kind of like the receiving end. The soma is the cell body, so kind of think about it as like the maintenance center, or where all the important functions just for the cell to survive are located. The axon is a long cable or a long, almost electrical wire that transmits the signal, and these axon terminals pass on the signal to the next neuron in a series or a system. So kind of looking at this picture over here, this is like a representation of what these neurons might look like in your brain or maybe in your spine. So as you can see here, even though they're all in series and they're kind of tangled up in almost like a web, you could still see the different parts. You can see here are the dendrites, here's the soma, here's the axon, and here are the axon terminals. So even though these individual components are kind of meshed and connected into this long network, you can still tell the individual components of each. So how do neurons communicate? Well, they communicate via brief electrical signals called action potentials. In this animated picture here, you see how there seems to be the signal moving down the length of this axon. So basically what's happening is that initially the outside of the axon is very positive. Think of like a positive charge. When the axon receives a signal through its dendrites, this barrier will open. So the positive signal will come in and the negative signal will go out. That's what you're seeing, how the positive signals and the negative signals in this animated picture are flipping. So that's basically how the action potential is generated. And through a process, this continues like a chain reaction down the axon and eventually reaches the axon terminals. So almost just think about it as like an electrical signal passing through a cable or your outlet at home so you can charge your phone. It's basically like that. So that's why there's another important structure called the myelin sheath. Conduct quickly and efficiently. So all along this axon, you're going to have like this almost like fatty coating that allows the signal to transmit faster as well as contains the signal within this single neuron so it doesn't unnecessarily spread to other neurons. That's what the action potential is. After the action potential travels from here all the way down to the axon terminals, the axon terminals, when they receive the electrical signals, that's going to trigger them to release these molecules called neurotransmitters. The axon terminals are going to release neurotransmitters. And then these neurotransmitters are going to travel to the dendrites of the next neuron. Basically, if you have enough neurotransmitters sort of attached to dendrite, it's going to basically trigger another electrical signal. So kind of looking at it in more detail. This is the axon terminal of one neuron connecting to the dendrite end of the next neuron. So this gap here is called the synapse. So where one neuron meets the other, that's called the synapse. Basically, what's going to happen is that this axon terminal right here is going to release all these small molecules, the neurotransmitters. And the neurotransmitters are going to bind to these receptors on the dendrites of the next neuron. And when there's enough of these neurotransmitters attached to these receptors, you're going to have the electrical signal transmitted through that next neuron. And it's almost like a chain reaction. It's going from one neuron to the next neuron. Another important thing to know about these action potentials and how these neurotransmitters work is that they're an all or nothing response. Think about it like pulling the trigger on a gun. Doesn't matter how much force with which you pull the trigger, as long as you pass that, what we call the threshold, the minimum strength or pressure needed to pull the trigger is going to release the bullet with the same amount of force. That's the same thing with these neurotransmitters. As long as there's enough neurotransmitters to meet like the requirements, it's going to fire and send the electrical signal down the axon with the same amount of electric power. Okay, so we talked about neurotransmitters. These are like almost the messengers that are going between these different neurons. And there are different kind of neurotransmitters as well, kind of going along with the fact that different neurotransmitters play with different functions. Here I've listed a few different neurotransmitters, the most common ones, and what their functions might be, and what might happen if there's too much of a neurotransmitter or too little. So if you think about when you're exercising or doing something very physical or very detailed with your movements, there's going to be a lot of acetylcholine crossing these synapses and communicating these electrical signals. Okay, so the nervous system. We've seen the kind of specific building block, the specific neuron, but now we want to take a zoom out and sort of see how they all connect together. So basically, the nervous system is the communication network of the brain and with the spinal cord. And this controls how we feel, like our sensation, and also how we act, how we respond to that sensation. So as you might expect, there's not just one type of neuron. Based on their different functions, classified into three different categories. You have sensory or afferent neurons, which basically they go from, let's say, your fingers to the brain. So basically, they're going to be the ones feeling this pressure, and they're going to be sending that signal to the brain. Then you have motor or efferent neurons. They're going to be taking a signal from the brain and going out to the body. So for example, by telling my arm to move like this, that's a signal that the motor neurons are carrying from my brain to my arm. Finally, you have interneurons. Interneurons are a connection between these sensory and motor neurons. I'll show you guys an example that really demonstrates these three different types of neurons in the next slide. So the nervous system is divided into two different parts. parts. First, you have the central nervous system, which just consists of two things, your brain and the spinal cord. So the brain is basically a complex network of these neurons that we talked about. But then your spinal cord is almost like a highway that takes these signals that your brain might produce and it travels down your spine and then it branches off so it can transmit them to different parts of the body. And those parts that branch off, those are called the peripheral part of your nervous system. Peripheral means on the edge or kind of around. So Choe mentioned the example of peripheral vision. So peripheral vision is like when I'm holding my finger here, I can still see it. So like kind of my ability to see things around me or on the edge of my vision. So that's why it's called the peripheral nervous system, because think about it, the brain and the spinal cord are in the center, but then the peripheral is branching around or going to the edge of your body from the center. So that's why it's called peripheral. So nerves are basically when you take a lot of different neurons, put them into a bundle. Think about taking lots of blades of grass and tying them into a bundle. Same concept. Taking a lot of thin strands and you're kind of grouping them into one big cable. So that's what these nerves are, basically big groups of neurons. So then you're going to have two divisions with the peripheral nervous system, the one outside the brain and the spinal cord. So those two divisions are the somatic division of the peripheral nervous system and the autonomic division of the peripheral nervous system. The somatic division, somatic means body, so very related to your body's functions. Think about the skeletal nervous system or the voluntary movements you have with your muscles. That's what the somatic division is. And then autonomic division. Autonomic sounds like automatic, and that's what it is. You kind of have your automatic functions being controlled by the autonomic division of the nervous system. For example, we don't think about our hearts beating, but they still continue beating. So those autonomic or automatic functions are controlled by the autonomic division. Okay, so the somatic division. So once again, the somatic division is kind of like the skeletal muscle division, and it controls voluntary movements and sensations. Think about controlling your muscles, telling your muscles to move. So once again, this is the good example to sort of illustrate the three types of neurons. So the three types of neurons were sensory, motor, and interneurons. So basically this is what's going to happen. Let's say this person, they're touching a really hot candle. So then a neuron is going to transmit this pain signal through this person's arm into their spinal cord. Could any of you guys guess maybe which type of neuron might be transmitting this painful signal from the flame to your spinal cord? Your sensory neurons, exactly right. They're sensing or kind of feeling this pain signal. Most of the time, once a sensation reaches the spinal cord's going to take it up to the brain. But then in the terms of a reflex reaction, reflexes are fast. You touch a candle, you're like, ow, is it immediate? Instead of going to the brain first, this pain signal carried by a sensory neuron goes through this interneuron. This interneuron connects the sensory neuron to a motor neuron. So that's why it's called between. And the motor neuron then produces the muscular reaction, the jerk back. And then after the cycle has completed, does the pain signal go up to the brain. So that's why oftentimes when you touch something really hot, that's why like you jerk your hand back and then you feel that pain and then you scream ow, because the pain signal travels to the motor neuron that jerks your hand back before your brain actually receives that signal and is able to register the pain. So the autonomic division sounds like automatic, and that's because it controls the automatic functions of the body. It is basically divided into two parts as well: the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, or the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest system over here. So they're not physically different. It's the same organs and kind of like the same organs that you're targeting, the same physical structures, but it's the different ways in which those are affected. So the sympathetic nervous system, or the fight or flight, is the one you get when you feel nervous, afraid, or angry. It's the one where your heart starts pounding, you start breathing really quickly, your mouth goes dry, and you feel like really tense. That's because this is an evolutionary adaptation where most of the times this would be triggered by a pressing physical threat, like going back to the idea of a prehistoric hunter being faced with a saber-toothed cat. This would be kind of like fight. You can either fight the cat or run away. So that's why you're feeling really tense and nervous, and that's what the sympathetic nervous system does. So the opposite of that would be the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest. Basically, after whatever was making you nervous has gone away, you start calming down. So that's basically the opposite. Your muscles start to relax and loosen, your heartbeat slows down, and then your digestive system is allowed to digest more. Think about it. If you're trying to run away from a cat, you don't want to be digesting. You don't want to have the possibility that you might have to go to the bathroom when you're running away from something that might eat you. So that's why digestion stops under the sympathetic nervous system. And the way that these two nervous divisions of the autonomic nervous system can affect so many organs is through the endocrine system. So the endocrine system of the body is separate from the nervous system. It's not made of neurons or nerves, but is controlled by the nervous system, as most things are in the body. And basically, when you're feeling nervous, your brain will sort of cause the endocrine system to release hormones and other chemical messengers into your bloodstream. And then as these chemical messengers are traveling through your blood, they're going to target these separate organs and kind of trigger that physiological response among these organs. A common example of a hormone that's triggered during the sympathetic nervous system response is adrenaline. People say that adrenaline gets you super hyped up, energetic, and that's what the sympathetic nervous system does. So that's kind of an example of a hormone that might be used to trigger the sympathetic nervous system. So now we go from just a general overview of the nervous system to the more specific organ of the brain, kind of what a lot of people try to consider the thinking center of the human body. Over here is a general picture of a brain. I'm sure most of you guys know what a brain looks like from pictures in your science class or whatnot, but the brain is divided into different structures as well. An interesting thing that sort of happened a long time ago was that people started thinking about, well, where do these things we call thought happen? Where do we think? Where do we feel? And they were surprisingly right. They thought about in their brain. But an interesting school of thought that emerged with that was called phrenology. So phrenology is kind of funny. People would look at the bumps on your head, how your head is shaped, and they would basically say, that part of your head is kind of bumped irregularly. I think that must mean that's the part that controls hunger. So they would just guess at what different parts of the head or the corresponding parts of the brain control what. And they would make these intricate maps and saying, oh, well, this part must control that. But they were totally wrong. What we got from that is the correct understanding that the brain has different parts that have different functions. So let's start with the oldest, and I said most primitive part, the brainstem. And by oldest or most primitive, I mean that this is the most basic part, the most basic functions of survival that almost all living creatures need to be alive. So it's made of a few different parts. You have the medulla oblongata right here, and basically it controls your heartbeat and breathing. So that's the most basic function. If you don't have that, someone will die. That's why the medulla right here is so important to protect. And living in California as we do, that's why when there's an earthquake, your teachers always tell you to cover up this part of your neck, because that's where the medulla is. For example, if something were to fall on that part and sever the medulla, there would be a high probability that your heart would stop and you would stop breathing, potentially leading to death. So that's why it's important to cover up this part of your brain and neck when you're under the desk in an earthquake. So the next part of the brainstem is the thalamus up here. I don't know if you guys know what a switchboard is, but think about it like almost like a policeman directing traffic. So it's basically is the sensory control center. And it's like a policeman in the traffic lane saying which signals can go up to the rest of the brain, which signals aren't allowed to go to the rest of the brain. So basically controls how much sensation we're getting at one point. Because we don't want to feel everything, that would be overwhelming, but we don't want to feel nothing either. So that's why it's important to have the thalamus there kind of mediating what we do feel and what we don't. And then you have the reticular formation. It's actually not in this picture, but it's like a covering that goes on top of the thalamus. And the reticular formation is the part of your brainstem that controls arousal. So kind of how excited you are, how awake, how active, those are all feelings and states controlled by the reticular formation. And it's also used for multitasking. It's similar to the thalamus in that it's like a crossing guard or a policeman directing traffic. It basically is able to divide up functions of the brain and send signals to different parts so you can work on two or more things at once. So an interesting sort of experiment that was conducted to find out the functioning of the reticular formation was these experimenters would take rats basically, and they would cut off the reticular formation. And when the reticular formation was cut off, the rats would fall asleep and would never wake up. That's because the reticular formation controls arousal. And therefore, if the rats aren't aroused or excited, well, they never regain consciousness. On the opposite end of that, when those same experimenters sort of stimulated or increased the functioning of the reticular formation, the rats get super excited and super awake. They wouldn't go to sleep at all. So that sort of informed the researchers, hey, that must be why the reticular formation controls arousal. Okay, so Jehu asked a very interesting question. Why do you breathe without thinking, but if you think about it, it stops breathing automatically? It's kind of like those things where if you're sitting in a really quiet room, you start noticing and hearing your own breath and your heartbeat, and then you start thinking about that and trying to control it. But basically, what's going on is kind of the idea of consciousness. What are we aware of? What are we not aware of? So usually the medulla takes care of that automatically. So we don't have to think about breathing every minute of every day. But sometimes we can sort of take that automatic control from the medulla and kind of move that sort of focus and intention into a different part of the brain. For example, from this unconscious part to a more conscious part, such as the cerebral cortex, which is like the outer covering. So basically, most of the times, yes, it is regulated by the medulla, but sometimes we can take conscious control of some of these functionings. An example that is not consciously controlled is like your digestion. No matter what you do, you can't really control your digestion. You can't say, I want to digest this food faster. No, it remains totally unconscious. But breathing is something we can control consciously. So that's a good example. Oh, one more question maybe. Why does it hurt when you accidentally bite your tongue, but it doesn't hurt if you do it on purpose? From Eric. Okay, that's a good question. If you think about it, it's kind of like I like flick myself almost. But like if you tell yourself this is gonna hurt, this is gonna really, really hurt, sometimes it does feel like it's hurting more. But other times when you flick yourself and you tell yourself it's not gonna hurt, it's not gonna hurt, it doesn't hurt as much. So there are some physical factors that Jehu and Victoria mentioned, like when you're more conscious, you might be flicking with less intensity, so you subconsciously don't want to hurt as much. Victoria also says it's bracing yourself physically, kind of saying, preparing yourself for the impact. Yeah, those are two really correct answers. Another more psychological aspect is, I don't know if you guys remember, but there's the cognitive approach to psychology. And the cognitive approach talks about how we perceive or how we choose to interpret events. So if we say and kind of interpret the pain as something like, ow, that really, really hurt, then our brain will try and reinforce that. It'll bring that pain to the primary focus in that moment. But if we choose to interpret that pain as saying, hey, it's not so bad, our brain will be like, hey, it must be no big deal, and moves it sort of to the back of our focus, sort of dulling that pain sensation. Like it's still there, but it's not as prominent as if we're interpreting or making it as a bigger deal than it needs to be. So that's why cognition is important, how we choose to interpret something like pain or a certain emotion. That's why that's important for our daily lives as well. Good questions, guys. Okay, cool. So the next part I wanted to talk about was the cerebellum. So here was the brainstem, like this part that kind of sticks down into your spinal cord. And here's the cerebellum, almost like this cup-shaped structure on both sides of your brain right here in the back. And it does a few things. It coordinates your movement and balance, and it also is important for processing some sensory input, mostly unconscious sensory input. It also enables nonverbal learning and memory. That's kind of like tying into the movement and balance, the physical aspect. An example is riding a bike. So riding a bike, people say once you learn it, you never forget it. Well, that's thanks to the cerebellum. A cerebellum basically coordinates that movement and stores it in your memory so that you don't have to think twice or learn twice when you're trying to ride a bike several years after first learning. Cool. So that's the basic function of the cerebellum. And then Choe had a good question. I read somewhere that there was an experiment where people who said ow experienced less pain than when they didn't say anything. And then Jay, a follow-up question, speaking of saying ow, why do people say ow when they get hit in a game even though they felt nothing? Okay, so addressing Choe's question, I think there might be a few explanations for that. Saying ow after they've been hit or kind of feel some sort of pain, sort of like really grimace tightly and kind of flex their muscles. It's kind of like a reaction to pain. And sometimes that has like a cognitive effect of alleviating that pain. Kind of, it's a way to cope, if you will, with that pain. So that might be why. Kind of there might be sort of the aspect of momentarily taking your attention, your selective attention off the pain into screaming ow really, really loudly. So that might distract from the pain as well. So that might be why in that experiment, the people who said ow sort of felt less pain than if they didn't say anything. And Jehu's question, why do people say ow if they don't hurt? Well, that might be because of social norm, how we learn to say ow when we hurt or something. It's kind of ingrained in our brain. So even though it doesn't really hurt, we'll just say ow because we feel like that's what people do when they get hit by something. So that's kind of why those two examples might be the way they are. Good questions, you guys. All right, so the limbic system. Great, emotions and motivations, two very important things that really make people people. So as you might be observing, we started way back here with this oldest, most primitive part of the brain. Now we're going into things that are more sophisticated. We went through complicated movements, sort of coordinating enough to ride a bike or maybe do a complicated ballet pose. And now we're getting even more complex emotions and motivations. Those are something that make more complex creatures and people separate from less developed ones. Like a sea slug probably won't have a wide range of emotions, but we people do. So yeah, that's why it's more advanced. And even if you look at the kind of the structure, the brainstem and the cerebellum, the most basic parts are at the bottom. And over time, it looks like it's gradually layered on the more complex structures. So that's kind of like a more evolutionary view of that. But let's go back to the limbic system. So basically, the amygdala is linked to strong emotions, especially fear and anger. So here's the amygdala, this little green dot right here. So whenever you feel really scared or you're really angry about something, or you're feeling like really aggressive, like, hey, that's not fair, I want to like punch a hole in the wall or something, that's your amygdala sort of taking over and kind of being the prominent part of your brain. So then you have the hypothalamus, which is kind of like, it's hidden, but it's kind of like under like this big brown oval right there. That's the hypothalamus. And basically the hypothalamus is linked to motivation. So there was an experiment done where rats had electrodes, kind of like these electrical signals placed in their hypothalamuses. And basically what happened was that when the scientists and experimenters stimulated those electrodes, made the hypothalamus more active, these rats could be made to do practically anything because the hypothalamus controls motivation. For example, when the hypothalamus of a rat was stimulated, the rat could be made to walk across an electrified grid. Even though it hurt, because they had the motivation, they would do that. The hypothalamus controls thirst, temperature, and hunger. It's the part of your brain saying, hey, you're hungry, why don't you eat? Hey, you're thirsty, why don't you take a drink of water? Also, unconsciously, it controls your body temperature so you don't get too hot unless you have a fever and you don't look too cold. And it's also kind of like what we call the boss of the endocrine system. So if we remember, the endocrine system was controlled by the autonomic system, but the hormones and other chemicals that kind of went into your bloodstream kind of controlled all these sympathetic or parasympathetic reactions. Your hypothalamus will control all of that. So basically, it's the part of your brain saying, hey, I want the fight or flight response. No, I want you to rest and digest. That's the part of your brain sort of flipping that on and off switch. All right, so now in the cerebral cortex, this outer covering, it's almost like if you took Play-Doh, rolled it really thin, and covered like a ball with it. That's kind of what the cerebral cortex would be, kind of like the outer layer. But it's also the most advanced. No other species other than humans has a cerebral cortex as advanced as we do. And it allows us to do higher function perception and reasoning. So you don't expect many animals to be able to do math as advanced as humans do. And that's thanks to the elevated capacity of the cerebral cortex. And it's divided into sections as well, these generalized sections called lobes that control a certain function generally. So let's start from the back. So here is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe controls vision. Kind of the way I remember is occipital sounds a lot like optical, and optical has to do with light and vision. So back here is where we sort of see, sort of the vision and perception takes place in the occipital lobe. Then up here, the parietal lobe is where body sensation happens. Let's say someone hits me on the arm, that's where I'll feel it there, kind of a little bit with balance and movement as well. Cerebellum controls most of that, but here is a little more conscious and intention movements. And then you have the somatosensory cortex, which also controls movements. It's a little more specific than the parietal lobe. And then you have the primary motor cortex. So this would be not just sensations. These are mostly just feeling. But here would be, I want to move this cup here. I want to type on my keyboard. That's kind of where the motor cortex plays in. And along the motor cortex, you have different divisions as well. So a different part of your motor cortex will move your arm, as opposed to a part of your motor cortex that moves your eye or something like that. And then frontal lobe is the most advanced. It's like final generation or something. It's basically complicated reasoning, morality, logic, that's all housed in the frontal lobe. That's why they're so advanced and unique to people, because, well, not many animals can sort of reason about morality and whatnot. So that's the most kind of where your judgment happens as well. Here, I know this is a very scary picture of a man who seems to have lost his eye. This was a man named Phineas Gage, and basically what happened to Phineas Gage was that he basically was a railroad construction worker. And one day, he accidentally impaled himself through the eye and up through his head. He survived, thankfully, but he lost part of his frontal lobe. Afterwards, he became very aggressive. He would do reckless actions like driving at unreasonable speeds. He would drink a lot. He become really brash with people. And that was because he lost his frontal lobe. And a frontal lobe, as we mentioned, deals with restraint, sort of your limits, your morality. And when he lost that part of himself, literally, he became a different person who was more aggressive. So that was an important case study where people really sort of understood the function of the frontal lobe. So any questions at this point?
Is deja vu like psychology, or is that completely unrelated?
Deja vu is part of psychology. And thanks for bringing that up, because I forgot to mention the part of the brain that deals with memory. So you see this curled part of your brain, that's the hippocampus. And basically the hippocampus is the part of your brain that deals with memory. So learning, kind of stuff you learn in school, kind of childhood memories, those are all centered in the hippocampus. So for those of you that don't know, deja vu is that feeling where I've been here before. It feels like the second time you're experiencing something. And there's not really a consensus yet on why we experience deja vu. People definitely do experience it and it's very real, but why is not quite clearly established. But there's a few different explanations. So the thing is that our attention is a lot more narrow than we'd like to admit. So that's why multitasking is not a good idea. We have a very specific selective attention. So oftentimes when it feels like you're experiencing something again, it is because you have, but the previous time you weren't attentive on that, so you don't consciously remember it. But your brain unconsciously stored that memory. So that's why it feels like you're experiencing again. It could also be really short between the times as well. For example, let's say you're in a lecture about biology, and the first time your teacher mentioned your brain cells, your selective attention was diverted elsewhere, but your brain still subconsciously remembers that. So by the time your teacher goes back to the summary and mentions brain cells again, you won't consciously remember it, but your brain will subconsciously remember it. So it feels familiar, but you're not sure why, because you can't remember that specific instance where you experienced it before. It might also have to do with something called reconsolidation in your memories, where when you remember something, you constantly revise it. So let's say I'm trying to remember my third birthday when I was 10 years old. I remember it. You try to sort of piece together the events, and then you store it away. Let's say I remember it again when I'm 12 years old. So I'm trying to remember it again, but kind of that process of revising and going over an event in your memory might produce something similar to deja vu. It's like a secondary explanation, but another possible explanation of why people get that feeling that they're remembering something that they should not. And something that I wanted to mention to you guys was the idea of mnemonic devices. I'm sure all of you guys have sort of known about mnemonic devices, where they're sort of devices to help you remember things. And there's like a psychological basis for this as well. People, they don't remember like terms and stuff like that, but they remember images and sounds really well. So that's why mnemonic devices to help you remember play with like images or sound. That's why, I don't know if you guys memorized the order of operations like this, but PEMDAS, it sounds nice. So we'll remember that sequence of letters. So kind of going with like this, I know there's a lot of terms thrown at you again, but let me just give you a few mnemonics that I use to remember. So medulla controls heartbeat and breathing. When I think of medulla, it sounds like a medal you might win in the Olympics. And a medal you place above your chest. Your chest is where your heart and your lungs are. So that's why I think medulla controls heartbeat and breathing. But reticular formation, in reticular, it sounds like you're tickling somebody. Reticular. So I just think about when you tickle someone, they get excited, they get aroused, and that's why reticular formation controls arousal. All right, so last question before we have to unfortunately wrap up. Kaden asked, where do fears and phobias come from? Good question. So a lot of times that might be because of prior experience, what we talked about the previous time with conditioning and classical conditioning, how we associate two things one with another, even though they might not be rationally related. So let's look at spider phobia. Let's say when someone was a young child, there was an instance where they saw a spider. Then, after seeing the spider, they fell out of the chair and felt a lot of pain. So they associated that pain with that seeing the spider. So eventually, through classical conditioning, that person might have sort of associated that fear and that pain with the image of a spider, kind of grow up to be someone who's afraid of spiders. There's actually an experiment called Little Albert experiment where a young child was repeatedly exposed to a rat and a loud sound at the same time. But eventually, the child would start crying at just seeing the rat itself. Sometimes you do have something in your childhood or some kind of classical conditioning association you've made that might cause those irrational phobias. Cool. So I think we're at time. So let me just end with this short assignment, totally optional. I want to encourage you guys to do more in-depth research on a part of the brain we explored today and try to find an experiment or study that displayed its functioning. For example, with the hypothalamus, I mentioned the rats being controlled and motivated by these electrodes implanted in their hypothalamuses. So an experiment like that would be concrete and tangible to sort of remember them by. Thanks so much for coming, guys.